So that's a game changer for all the economic questions. Once you understand this, you realize we don't have to have unemployment. We don't have to have business cycles. We don't have to have recurring banking crises, because these are all accounting problems, accounting fictions that can be very easily solved. They don't have to be real problems if you don't want them to be. And sadly, that's what we find, that often decision makers want them to be problems. We don't have to have underdevelopment. There don't need to be underdeveloped countries. And of course, we don't need to deplete finite resources, but we can actually deploy things so that there is an abundance for everyone. Prosperity for everyone is possible if you deploy bank credit creation correctly. Now that you know this, actually just maybe the technical expression of this, you can put this in some formula. Total money is credit creation in the banking system. You can divide into two streams going into the economy, GDP, national income. Or money creation can also be used for non-GDP transactions, which is asset purchases, when banks lend for the purchase of ownership rights. Then money goes into asset markets. And of course, you can imagine when that happens, this is unproductive credit creation. Asset purchases funded by banks, whether it's property, real estate, or financial instruments, or mergers, acquisitions, takeover of other companies, lending to private equity funds, hedge funds, all that's over here. In many countries, that's the dominant form of bank credit, vastly outclassing any other form. And what you then get is asset price inflation. It's like printing a lot of money, pumping it into asset markets. What's going to happen with asset prices? Of course, they're going to go up. It's a Ponzi scheme, a pyramid scheme, a snowball scheme. This will only work while banks continue to create more credit for asset purchases. Once they stop, it's like a game of musical chairs. The music ends. There's not enough chairs for everyone because asset prices don't rise any further. The late-coming investors go bust first. You have non-performing loans. The banks then restrict lending for asset purchases. Asset prices really collapse. Then you have a major banking crisis. This is, of course, unsustainable, unproductive and unsustainable. And because during these asset bubbles, you push up asset prices by several 100%, but from the peak, they only need to drop by 10%, and you've busted the banking system because banks only have 10% or less equity, which is used when you have non-performing loans. And so the banks, therefore, are easily bankrupted and there's easily a banking crisis. But we don't have to have this. It can be easily prevented, or even if you have a banking crisis, you can easily get out of this. The other uses of money, there's one more unsustainable, unproductive form in the real economy, that's consumer loans, as you can imagine, because you create more money, more demand, but there's no more goods and services. Consumer price inflation follows. And then we have the redeeming feature of the banking system. If banks create credit for productive purposes, for productive business investment, for the implementation of new technologies, increasing productivity, you will get growth, you will get prosperity. This also delivers income streams to service and repay the loans, and therefore you don't have systemically the problem of non-performing loans. There's never been a banking crisis due to too much small firm business investment. So, because that's productive business investment that creates jobs and prosperity. And the interesting thing is we can have more growth and higher growth even at full employment, because the only limit to growth actually is human ingenuity, and that is virtually without limit. We have plenty of ideas, new technologies, new inventions. They just need to be funded with credit creation, and you can then implement them and turn them into prosperity, because you get this new value added that's created and that can be shared. If you have a banking system that is structured so that you can share easily, which is a very decentralized banking system with many small banks, local banks, community banks. But we'll come to that. And so you can test this. This is the quantity theory of disaggregated credit. Credit in the real economy drives GDP. Credit for asset prices, asset purchase drives asset markets. In Japan here, Japanese data, they increased bank credit in the early 70s drastically. In the real estate market, driving up asset prices, real estate prices here, then created a crash. They did this in the UK as well. Mostly central banks operate in a very coordinated fashion. When you increase credit for financial circulation as a share of total credit this dramatically, of course you are creating an asset bubble. That's the creation of the 1980s great Japanese asset bubble, when the little plot of land in central Tokyo around the Imperial Palace was worth as much as the entire state of California, including Los Angeles and San Francisco. These were the data. That was what was created, this massive asset bubble. And here's another way of showing this. Broad credit creation, total credit creation, way in excess of GDP growth. That's this excess money creation for asset purchases, creating an asset bubble, and then a banking crisis the moment you reduce bank credit. So let's, now with this tool and this understanding, we can actually now solve any economic problem, and there's many that traditional theories cannot explain. But since I'm supposed to speak for only 3.5 minutes, I believe, or was that 3.5 per slide? I can't go through all the other puzzles which can be solved with this, but let's just return to the inflation of the 70s. So why do we have this inflation? Remember, they told us it's because of the war, and then the OPEC oil embargo and this energy supply shock. But let's look at the data. This is bank credit creation in the US, and we find that it was revved up dramatically by June 71, already growing by 13.5%, which is the highest post-war at that time. And that's 71. Then peak in March 73 at 16.4%. Massive money creation pumped into the economy. What's going to happen with nominal GDP? What's going to happen with inflation? Of course, you are going to create inflation later. The war only happened, and the OPEC oil price shock only happened in autumn 1973. And therefore, we know the cause is actually, of course, the credit boom created by the banking system under the auspices of the Federal Reserve. There was a second oil price shock, we're told, in the late 70s. Well, actually, no, that's another credit shock in the late 70s that caused this. And the same is true for other countries. In Germany, bank credit growth expanded by 14%. And that was before the so-called OPEC oil price shock. And that's really why inflation rose. Japan, where we had much higher inflation, well, we had much higher bank credit expansion, 25.5%, December 72. That's before the alleged official cause, the oil price shock. So the 70s inflation was not due to energy prices. And likewise, today's inflation is not due to energy prices or the war. As you know, because of course the war only started in Ukraine, only started at the end of February, but the inflation was already very high even before then. So it's quite apparent that the official narrative is wrong. And remember, we looked at this, how the Japanese central bank created a massive asset bubble in 1972. That's never mentioned. Very briefly, let's look at the current situation. A lot of people did not expect the 2020 massive monetary expansion by the Federal Reserve and other central banks to lead to inflation, because they compared to 2008. In 2008, it was the other way around. There was a financial crisis. The Federal Reserve massively expanded in quantitative terms, what many people call quantitative easing. And they expected inflation in a weaker dollar. I was one of the few economists who were saying, no, we're not going to get inflation or a weaker dollar, because they are not actually creating more money. And that's because the central bank is a small cog in the game of money creation. The banking system is much bigger. And bank credit creation then was shrinking, it was negative. That's when the Federal Reserve stepped in and created a lot of dollars. But in absolute terms, total money supply was still shrinking because the banking system was contracting. So, of course, you couldn't get inflation at that time. But it's been totally different in the 2020 reflation, because the Federal Reserve injected money, similarly to 2008, but the banking system has been creating much more money. In fact, it was one of the highest growth rates since the 70s. Then there was a period of contraction, but you notice that the Federal Reserve is not anymore expanding quantitatively this much, but the banking system continues to create credit. So the inflation is going to continue. And of course, inflation is stealth taxation, and it is an unnecessary restriction on the prosperity that we could have